Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan Little, and today we're going to be discussing short stacked preflop fold equity, which is one of the most important concepts that you must fully understand if you want to have success in poker tournaments. Just the other day, in an episode of Weekly Poker Hand, I showed this situation from the World Series of Poker main event, where the low jack player raises to two big blinds, player on the button calls, and then I have 10-9 of spades in the big blind. And I said, this is a spot where going all in very easily could be the best play. I ended up calling in this spot, but one of my students who was paying attention said, why? Why would we want to go all in this scenario? So let's break it down. Let's think about this. If we do go all in, one of two things can happen. Either we're going to win the small pot when everyone folds, or we're going to get called and we're going to be slightly behind with some dead money in the pot, right? Those are two things that can happen. So, should we shove in the spot? Well, the value of this play can be determined using math. And realize you do not have to or need to use this math at the poker table. So many people get immediately turned off when they hear the word math and they think, oh, I can't do math. Well, I can tell you, I've literally never done this equation at the poker table. And I have many students who have never done this equation because, well, they follow me and I tell them how and when to use the concepts that come from the math. You can go as deep in math as you would like in poker, but to have a pretty decent level of success, you just have to know the principles that come from it. And by the end of this video, you are going to know two situations where you should be shoving with a wide range. Before we get there, if you're enjoying my content, click like, click subscribe. That goes a long way to helping me help other people like you who want to improve their poker skills. So thanks for that. So let's break this down. Don't be turned off by the math. Don't be turned off by the math. Don't be turned off by the math. You're going to be okay. It's going to be quick and painless. So the profit, the amount of money we make here, equals the percent our opponents fold times the pot that we win when they do fold, right? Plus, that was the first part of the situation. The percent that the first opponent calls times the equity, our equity in the pot times the total pot when we get called, minus the amount we're putting in the pot. This is basically how much we lose when we shove and they call on average. Well, when the first player calls, and then the percent of the time that the second player calls times how much we lose when they call us. Okay? Notice this situation is a little bit more difficult than it normally would be because we're against two opponents. If we're against one opponent, it would be easier. This part of the equation would just be deleted, right? So all we have to do now is fill in these blanks. It's going to require us to make some assumptions, though. We need to figure out how often the opponents fold, which will then tell us how often they call. And to figure this out, we need to know each player's range as well as the range that they will call the all-in with. So let's take a second and think about it. The initial raiser is probably going to raise with something like this. This is a reasonable low jack raising range for a decent player. Maybe they're a little bit tighter, maybe they're a little bit looser, but we're going to assume this for now. And you're going to find that if you make good assumptions about your opponents, you're often pretty close to right about this. And if you, well, make bad assumptions, then your math's going to be way off. But this is a reasonable low jack strategy, and I think this is probably what a lot of people do. So he's raising all the hands in red and blue preflop, and then when I go all in, he's calling it off with only the hands in red. Okay? So, using the Poker Coaching Range Analyzer, which is in the tool section at my training site, pokercoaching.com, go there, check it out. You can get a completely free trial, and you can actually sign up for a full membership. And if you don't like it, within 30 days, ask me for a refund. If I do not help you get better at poker, I don't deserve your money, and I don't want your money. So it's basically free to try. So using the range analyzer, you'll see here that he's going to call the all-in about 33% of the time, which means he's going to fold 67% of the time. That's for the first raiser. Now, the caller is a little bit more difficult to figure out because callers will call with various ranges, right? I'm actually going to use a pretty rough scenario for me to show you how this looks in basically the worst case scenario. And that is when the caller actually calls with some hands that are still pretty good, which they should if they're good players, but a lot of bad players will not do this. So notice here, the caller's calling with all these hands in blue, which again, may not be quite accurate. Maybe it's a little bit looser, maybe it's a little bit tighter. But I have him calling off our 22 big blind all in with the hands in red, which may be a little bit optimistic. So that means he's going to call off 36% of the time and fold 64% of the time, right? Every once in a while, both players will call, but you're going to find that's very rarely the case unless the preflop caller has a lot of traps in his range. But that's probably not going to happen if you go back to the initial situation, because realize they're both playing pretty deep stacked against each other, right? If this guy just has aces, kings, queens, ace, king, he's going to want to re-raise those. So you can pretty much discount that from that caller's range. Okay, so now we have our two ranges. We need to now plug in these percentages. 33% is the time the first player calls. 35% is the time the second player calls. 100% minus 33 minus 35 is 32. We're filling in the blanks, right? And realize that math is a little bit rough, but it's close enough for now. Okay, now that we have those ranges, we can use Equalab, which is a completely free program. Go download it. We can use that to figure out our equity against each opponent's calling range. Okay, so 10-9 suited against the first player's range wins 33% of the time. 10-9 suited against the second player's range wins 60% of the time. So 33 is going to go here. 60 is going to go here. Okay. There it is, 33. Did I screw up something? 39, oh, 40. I'm sorry, 33 and 40. Don't know what I just said there. I maybe said that wrong, I apologize. I put 39, close enough. Okay, when you win the now we're gonna fill in these other blanks, right? We're just filling in the blanks, taking our time. Go slow when you're doing this on your own, fill in the blanks. When you win the pot preflop, how much do we win? Well, let's go back to this situation. We win the 8,000 plus the 8,000 plus the small blind plus the big blind plus the big blind ante. I realize that this is our 4,000 chips, but once your chips are in the pot, they are no longer yours. They basically do not count as being in your stack. So whenever we shove and they all fold, we get 26,000, which is just all the money in the pot, right? Now, when we get called, when we go all in and get called, we need to figure out the total pot. So that's our 88,000 total stack times 2. 88 plus 88, plus any additional money in the pot, which in this case will be either the preflop call or the preflop raise that folded, plus small blind plus the big blind ante, which equals 190,000. Okay? That number is going to go right here and right here. Okay? Then we put in 84,000 more into the pot, but remember that 4,000 does not count, so that number is going to go right here and right here. Okay, so now we solve it. Here's our full equation. I already did the math for you. This comes out to 8,300. This comes out to 7,000. And then the back end of the equation comes out to 3,400. But these numbers are negative. So you solve that, and we actually lose 2,000 chips by jamming. So this is a situation where, given the assumptions I made, we should not shove, which is why I did not shove in the game. However, what happens if the opponents fold just a little bit more often? Notice this number will become smaller, and this number will become smaller, which means this number will become bigger. And there's some tipping point where this number starts to become profitable. And you're going to find that if they fold just a little bit more often, then it starts to become very profitable. Let's actually think about this, though. Remember how I said initially that this player may not have this range. Maybe they 3-bet just all their best hands. If they 3-bet with what's called a linear range, right? Which means that perhaps they don't have any of these hands in red in their range, or these good hands in their range. So their range is all of these hands in blue. And if the range is all these hands in blue, the second player may actually fold their entire range. What happens in that scenario? Well, let's do a little bit of math. Basically, we just lop off the back end of the equation. Now we have 67% when they both fold, because remember the first guy only calls a third of the time, times the same number minus 77,000 in this spot. And now we're profiting 10,000 chips, 2.5 big blinds. And that is huge. So a big takeaway from this point is that if the caller is likely to be weak, and you think the raiser is just playing kind of normally, or perhaps even a little bit too loose, you can jam with a very, very wide range. And your preflop hand doesn't actually matter all that much, because you're going to find that even some junky hands like 10-6 suited, well, let's just run them right here. 10-6 suited, you see, has 29% equity. Let's say pocket twos. Pocket twos, 34% equity, right? Ace 2 offsuit, 28% equity. What about a queen 2 offsuit? Really bad hand. 23% equity. Okay, so that's starting to get bad. But notice, all that does is just change this little number here, which doesn't actually matter all that much in the grand scheme of things because that number gets multiplied by only 0.33. So reasonable hands, 10-6 suited, ace 2 offsuit, right? These all could be highly, highly profitable if the caller is very likely to fold. So look for that spot where whenever it goes raise call and you have 20 or 25 big blinds, you can just rip it all in and they are actually going to fold probably more than you would expect. And that's going to result in you winning a huge amount of chips in this scenario, which is way, way more than you could possibly make by calling pre-flop and then playing from out of position. You're going to find, by the way, when you call and play from out of position with the 10-9 suited here, you're going to like roughly break even, which, is better than losing the pot, but it's better than folding, but it's way worse than plus 10,000 chips. Way worse. So that's situation number one. Let's think about this if we're against only one opponent. So let's assume the opponent is raising from the low jack seat. Same situation, except for this guy raises, but the button now folds. So now we're heads up, okay? In this situation, if the opponent raises and then calls off, pretty wide, about half of the time, running through all the numbers, plugging in all the numbers, we see we lose 240 chips. So in this scenario, shoving's probably not ideal and calling is still best. But what if we widen this opponent's range a bit? Well, now we give this player a much wider pre-flop range. This is basically assuming this player raises from the button. Okay? So if they fold to the player on the button and he raises with 53% of hands and then calls off like this, which I think is actually what a lot of players who have not studied will do. They'll call off with hands that they think are pretty good, right? I mean, pocket fives are better, ace 8 suited are better, ace 10 offsuit are better, and king jack are better. Are people really calling your all-ins here like king 9 suited for 22 big blinds or ace 9 offsuit? A lot of people aren't. So if our opponent uses this strategy, we actually win 5,000 chips by jamming, which is a lot. Again, this is a nice amount of profit, and you really cannot turn this down. Again, notice if this number was not 37, if we were jamming with a weaker hand than 10-9 suited, let's say it was 30%, it's not going to make this number so big to the point that it overtakes this number. So you can actually shove in this spot very wide. I actually won this trophy and this trophy using this exact strategy of just jamming wide and making people fold way too often. And, still how I win today. I actually won this trophy in a turbo tournament not too long ago using the exact same strategies. People would raise too wide from late position and then fold to jams. And they do this over and over and over again. And every time this happens, you just print 5,000 chips over and over and over. I'll show you what actually happens in some really soft tournaments, though. Now, let's assume same 50-ish% raising range, but now the opponent calls with only the good hands, the hands that they just think are very good. Sevens and better, ace 10 suited and better, king, queen, and ace jack offsuit. Now, when we jam, we actually win a huge amount. 11,000 chips, printing money again. And you can jam in this scenario. If your opponent uses this strategy, you can jam with literally any two cards. I'll show you real quick. Let's give us the absolute worst hand. I didn't plan on doing this, but hey, why not? Let's give us 7-2 offsuit. Let's plug in the opponent's calling range. I'm doing that on the side here. Click evaluate. You see we have 23% equity, okay? With 7-2 offsuit. This number would become 23, okay? Notice the first number is not going to change here. So what we would now do is we get our calculator and we would do 0.23 times 182,000 equals minus 84,000 equals times 0.17 equals minus 7,000. So this number is going to be minus 7,000 now, 7163. Okay. And then we get the calculator again. Got the wrong calculator, 1 second. Turns out I have 5 calculator applications open right now. Plus 14,940 equals 7,776 chips. So in this scenario, If our opponent uses this strategy of raising 50-ish% of hands on the button, 53%, which actually isn't all that absurd, and they only call off with the best hands, which a lot of people, especially in small, medium stakes, do, you can literally go all in here with any 2 cards. Now, as you jam more often in this situation, your opponents will start calling off more often. So I'm not saying you should jam with any 2 cards, but what I wanted to show you here is that you could, right? And if you have a tight image in these scenarios, you can actually jam very wide. So a few main takeaways from this for you to apply to the next game that you play. If your opponents raise with tight ranges and then call off appropriately, which they will be doing if they raise with strong ranges, then you really should not be bluff jamming all in all that often. You should just be jamming with the best hands that are in good shape against their range, right? Because notice, an easy way to get an edge here is to just make this number bigger, right? If this number is like 45%, which means, if you're just shoving really good hands, well, then now this back end of the equation will actually be profitable. So if you're profitable or break even on the back end, and then obviously profitable whenever they fold, you're going to profit, right? See how you can think about these scenarios mathematically if you understand the equations. But if they are raising with good hands, don't bluff all in, right? If they'll raise with wide ranges, though, and they will not call off appropriately, which is going to be the case against players who have not studied enough, assuming they're not just like absolute calling stations, which, some people are. You have to pay attention, right? But if they are raising wide and not calling off appropriately, you can jam very wide as a bluff. So you want to be targeting late position raisers because they're going to open wide, just naturally, right? And if you have a tight image, just because for whatever reason you've had no cards, maybe you've been tight, maybe you play tight in general, well, they're going to fold to you a ton. My dad actually used to lose at poker, and then I kept telling him, you need to be jamming with your short stack, Dad. One day he decided, you know what, I'm fed up, I'm just going to start jamming with my short stacks. And you know what? He actually won the very next tournament he played. And it's because everybody thought he was a nit. And if they think you're a nit, but you just start jamming really wide, they're just going to assume you got hit by the deck. And they're going to fold and fold and fold and fold. And you're going to print these 2, 3, 4 big blinds over and over and over and over again. And whenever you're, instead of losing a big blind every time you're in the big blind, you are winning money, well, clearly that's going to be way better for you. Also, in multi-way pots, sometimes the callers will rarely call off against your all-in. You need to pay attention to these players and figure it out. That's often going to be the case if someone raises and the caller calls frequently. Or if they re-raise with just all their best hands, with a linear strategy, right? If that's the case, they're basically adding enough dead money into the pot to the point that it becomes profitable to jam. And the fact that they are in the pot will often scare the initial raiser into only calling off with their best hands because they think they have to worry about the caller yet to act, but in reality they don't. So those are 2 main takeaways. One other main takeaway that, didn't necessarily allude to here, but you can actually use this strategy from other positions. Like say cutoff raises and you're on the button. Cutoff should be raising kind of wide and you get to jam. But then you have to worry about the small blind and the big blind waking up with a hand some portion of the time. So going back to the initial equation, you would have this here for when the raiser calls off, but you'd actually have some small percentage when the small blind calls off, plus some small percentage when the big blind calls off. But that's going to be like 0.6% of the time or 0.06% of the time, right? Think about it. If cutoff raises, button jams, how often is the small blind really calling off? I mean, let's think about it. They got to be really tight, right? They're probably calling off like this. Notice this is only 5% of hands or 4.7% of hands. So that number is going to be roughly 4.7 for the small blind, roughly 4.7 for the big blind, which is not a ton. But if under the gun jams and then you're in second position, obviously you can't shove very wide because you have to worry about the low jack, the hijack, the cutoff, the button, the small blind, the big blind. 6 people, all who are going to call off with the top 4 or 5% of their hands every time. So then you can't really bluff, right? So as there are fewer people yet to act, you get to bluff with a wider range. So that's going to be it for today. This video is a little bit longer than I wanted, but I guess that's how it goes sometimes. This skill is vitally important when you are playing shallow stacked tournaments, which I understand are most tournaments. In most tournaments, at some point, the stacks are going to start to get shallow. And if you play too tightly, too conservatively, and you are not jamming in these scenarios, your stack is just going to consistently dwindle down. And the tough part about this is that if you're really tight, when you do jam, you're not going to get called because your opponents know you're a nit, right? The nice thing about this strategy is it usually results in you slowly chipping up over time, which is good, right? Or you get it all in. And when you get it all in, yeah, sometimes you lose. But you're making money. every single time you jam in these situations. And if you're consistently making profitable plays, the chips are going to flow your direction in the long run. And that is what I want for all of you. I want you to crush poker like many of my students are doing. So get in there, apply what you learn. Let me know in the comment section after you get in there and crush the next tournament you play, because your opponents are not going to be expecting this if you never do it. So that's me for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, click like, click subscribe, share this with your friends, and I hope you have a fantastic day. Good luck in your games and have fun, and I'll talk to you next time.